The Laowa 7.5, it's the world's widest rectilinear lens for micro four thirds cameras, and it has easily produced some of the nicest images I've ever filmed. It's also the lens I get asked about the most on my videos, so it might be a bit strange that I actually find this lens very hard to recommend. Even though this is a fairly recent lens, is it even worth it in 2020? The micro four thirds system seems to be under threat, with Olympus recently announcing they were pulling out of making cameras, and Panasonic looking to commit to larger format sensors. It doesn't seem likely that Blackmagic will produce another micro four thirds camera either, based on how the industry is trending. So what's the point? Now the first key point is how wide the lens is, because that's really why anyone would want to buy it in the first place. On the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, which has a crop factor of 1.9, that's around 14.25mm. Right there is the lens's biggest selling point. The images you'll get out of this lens will be extremely similar to the style of Terrence Malick or Emmanuel Lubezki, both of whom love using extremely wide lenses. In fact, legend says that Malick shot his latest film, A Hidden Life, predominantly on 12mm lenses, and he didn't use anything longer than a 16mm lens. But there's the main problem. Unless you want that to be your style, to heavily rely on wide-angle lenses, do you really want this lens? Owning it is all about flexing how wide you can go. There's other very wide lenses out there at more reasonable focal lengths, like the Laowa 9mm f2.8, which is the equivalent of roughly 17mm. In fact, I've heard a lot of people go to that lens instead of this one, purely because it's a more reasonable focal length. But the Laowa 7.5 was actually the reason why I bought the Blackmagic Pocket 4K over the 6K. As cool as it would be to have a Super 35 sensor, there is simply no other lens for the 6K that is as wide, bright, and small in one package. Sure, there are some extremely wide lenses you can buy, but none of them are the same. But at the same time, I've also found myself going months without even using this lens. It can be very difficult to justify its existence on paid jobs, aside from establishing shots. Do you really want to pay more than 900 Australian dollars for a lens that will only be used on 1 or 2 shots per scene? And yet, this lens can be an attractive proposition on the set. I used it once when filming an interview, and the result was quite strange as we cropped it into 1080p, and the result was a 60mm lens without any depth. The other time was a church service during COVID-19, where we really wanted to highlight the empty halls of the church. This lens did that brilliantly, as you can see just how vast the space is. It's difficult to explain how wide it really is. You could be sitting a few meters from a wall and be able to see all 4 corners of the room. A lot of people talk about how 35mm is the most immersive focal length because it's closest to the human eye, but I actually think wider is more impressive. You feel like you're really there in the scene because the filmmakers can't really hide anything, which may be a problem using this lens. When racking focus, it's a bit difficult keeping your fingers out of the way. Also, even though Laowa claims this lens is zero distortion, the edges are a bit stretched, so it's always better to keep your subject in center frame. Unless you want hilarious results. This lens is a beast on a gimbal. Easy to set up because of how small and light it is. I love taking it out on my travels and really capturing the essence of the outdoors. The other advantage is because of its width, you can almost always just set it to infinity focus and never need to change it again unless your subject comes very close to the camera. However, I have found that this lens can be too bright sometimes. On the Pocket 4K, even at ISO 400 with the lens stopped down at a high frame rate, you can still blow the highlights. I would recommend thinking about an ND filter, though I haven't bought one for myself yet because a bit of clipping doesn't actually bother me too much. But just know, if you're planning on shooting at a normal frame rate, you'll definitely want NDs for outside work, as you'll blow out even stopped down. But despite its amazing wide imagery and beautiful sharpness, it's still made for a camera mount that many would argue has already had its time. Based on that alone, this lens doesn't really have a market in 2020, aside from those committed to using their micro four thirds camera for the foreseeable future. And even then, most micro four thirds users probably won't find a lot of use in having an extremely wide lens. But if you're a Lubezki-loving, Blackmagic-owning filmmaker who will really appreciate filming as wide as possible and really immersing your audience in the scene, then this lens is for you.